So then we move on to the next presenter, Marcy. As the presentation loads, Marcy, could you please introduce yourself briefly?
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Amai, working with the Professional in World Bank, and my co-author is the Maritime and Port Export Security, working with the Kenyan government. So we'll be presenting on a policy brief on the impact of the sea level rise to the maritime zone. Thank you very much. So thank you. So I'll give a background on our policy brief that is specific, focusing on the aspect of the global warming, sea level rise, and its direct impact to the maritime zone boundaries, which are well defined by the baselines that always comes from the low-lying points. And we know that the changes at the coastline, especially with the sea level rise, has resulted to changes in areas of exploration, utilization, and the current issues of maritime boundary delimitation. Currently, we are having a case that just concluded Kenya and Somalia, and these are the factors that have direct impact. The policy brief will illustrate how the rising sea level and the receding boundaries has resulted in the conflicts and threatened the relations in various states, which has a direct implication on the legal framework. With the climate change aspect, we know that the sea level rise has exerted a lot of pressure on the coast shoreline, and the impact includes the loss of coastal land and infrastructure. We have the destruction of the fishing zone. We have also the habitat, the loss of the habitat that has resulted to a lot of unsustainable exploitation. These are challenges that are being faced across many regions, and this has directly affected the international boundaries and also creating a pressure in the resources. Also, in the aspect of international law of sea, we see that there are issues of dispute and conflict arising that probably requires a way that policymakers can come up with a solution towards a best approach of handling such conflicts. There have been significant threats at the international security that needs to give appropriate attention existing, especially at the boundary issues and the interstate disputes. And for this policy brief, then it wants to balance the act between the access of the resources, as well protecting the maritime zone that gives a comprehensive framework that also gives each state at least that sovereignty right to explore some of these resources, especially at this point when you want to do a lot of sustainability exploration just to boost our blue economy aspect. So the policy briefs will also go ahead and give recommendation on how best we can implement these resources within this maritime zones area to ensure that you have sustainable utilization of these resources, but more importantly, ensure that we protect our maritime zones by reducing the conflicts that is within different states in different regions. But my focus will be majorly Kenya, with few case studies at the Indian Ocean. To the next slide. Thank you. For methodology, this being a desktop review, we focus more on scenario analysis, especially having the cases of maritime dispute at the ICJ. We have desktop review when having the reports of IPCC and just trying to analyze the sea level rise impacts. We have legal and institutional reviews. This one we're focusing more on the governance aspect of these maritime zones. And then of course, having the focal group discussion, having a community discussion on how this sea level rise has really impacted them on the ground. We also have the aspect of observation. Where I come from in Mombasa, you'll see that the low-lying areas, currently there've been a lot of flooding and droughts in some other areas. So that is an observation that directly relates to the subject discussion. We also have the field assessment, secondary data analysis. And for the aspect of law of sea, we have the ICJ judges giving ruling and interpretation. So for this policy brief relies more on the expert opinion, knowing that the law of sea is a framework that didn't really cover up some dynamics of issues such as sea level rise when this framework was being developed. To the next slide. So our key finding involved the issues linking the sea level rise to the maritime zoning. And this was that the effect of the sea level rise upon the vulnerability to the coastline and community infrastructure, it has led to loss of the wetlands. We have also the loss of exclusive economic rights. over extensive areas, especially when you're foreseeing that a certain area on maritime zone will have to be lost due to a shifting of our baseline, or what we call the low-lying areas. There's a point of always starting to count the maritime zone of each state. We also have the destruction of existing economic infrastructure, and also the damages of subsistence and commercial fisheries production, especially when you have the shift of this fishing zone, and which now is directly interpreted with the zones that are for certain sovereignty rights of certain country when they have to move. For the key finding of shifting baseline, this will be focused on the maritime zone aspect. We'll say that foreseeing the sea level rise will result to a shifting baseline. We say that these are the low-lying areas where we start counting our boundaries. And if it has to change, then it adjusts all the outer limits of the maritime zone. This includes the territorial water, which has its own rights, hoping that everyone understands the rights of the territorial. Then we have the exclusive economic zone to the continental shelf until down to the highest. So when this changes, it definitely changes the right within the states of those areas. Also, we have the changes to the baseline that could impact the maritime boundaries, especially to the adjacent and opposite states. A case scenario of Kenya-Somalia, for instance, if we have the sea level impact changes the low-lying areas, then it means in the coming years, then if someone has a dispute or challenges the boundary line between the two states across each other, then that tells you that there'll be changes of already areas that are well known to be the sovereignty right of other countries. So when you say that there's a baseline moves, definitely there's a way to move. For instance, if the sea level rises up to the changes of the law, then it results to the shift of the baseline. That it means that the water moves inland. So our territorial water means it moves to the land side. Then we have the exclusive economic zone moving towards the territorial, and that one goes to the last maritime zone of the country. And that one has a shift to the sovereignty rights, just as I've explained. And this one will result to issues of conflict, issues of resources exploitation, because it limits one to all that. Other finding during the research then found out that the sea level rise will lead to submerge of large and disrupted established zone. And for the islands, we realize after there's this sea level rise, some of the island will disappear. Following the law of sea convention on issues of island, then if an island disappears and then becomes a rock, then it means that you have to lose some of the rights within that zone that was already established. Further, then going forward, then what are these linkage between the ocean governance with the aspect of maritime zone on issues of sea level rise? Then we have to think of what are the solutions. So we are thinking of freezing the baseline. This is to mean that at the end of the day, when you freeze this baseline and it's accepted by the international community, then it means that we have to convert the permanent baseline to remain as it is, so that the internal waters to the exclusive economic zone to the high seas water remain as it is. Then if we decide to freeze the state's baseline, then it means even with the sea level rise, then we don't have to lose some of the areas that will result to the dispute and the conflict. But most importantly, then we have to have strategy to adopt on the climate resilience to reduce this economic impact of the sea level rise. Next. Also, we see further that there's a need to have a robust strategic plan to prepare us with the uncertainty future of this extreme weather. We will all agree that for the law of sea, it never foresaw the aspect of sea level rise. And now if you're seeing a conflict resulting out of it, then you have to come up with a strategic plan, especially within the regions. And one of them will be freezing the outer limit zone, depending with the agreement. But for the islands then and archipelagic areas, it's a different concept, especially when you're having the third state in this maritime zone that shares some of the spaces in between. However, for best way to go forward, then you have to consider the rights of all the two states and the third states, especially when it comes to island and the archipelagic states. To the next slide. So what will be your recommendation on this policy brief for the policymakers at the national and the regional level? For Kenya, to be specific, there's need to amend the legislation on Maritime Zone Act and adopt a principle that is in the Vienna Convention on a Fundamental Change of Circumstance, because we assume that the sea level rise was not foreseen. But at this moment, if we take it as a fundamental change of circumstance, then it gives us the opportunity to explore other articles within the law of sea to fix this issue. And one of it will be fixing the outer limit of the maritime zone to be ambulatory, and that is found in the Law of Sea Convention at Article 76. We can also have an option of maintaining the already existing zones through bilateral and multilateral agreement, especially to states that border each other. Also, we have the aspect of freezing the outer limit of maritime zones and baseline, or always converting these waters to be historic waters, so that even when you're having all these changes within the zones, then you don't have to bring up the aspect of changes of this zone in aspect of the resources and utilizations. Second recommendation was to amend the Climate Change Act of 2016 that we currently have, to incorporate the aspect of fixing principle, so that we have a legal physical change principle that includes the aspect of comprehensive details of navigation, which is very key in law of sea. We have also the aspect of protection of cables and conservation of living resources, which have been left out for the time being, and also promote consistent approach and management of the resources. Now that you're talking of the area beyond national jurisdiction, these are things and principles that need to be considered in the national policy when developing or amending the already existing policies. Then we have the aspect of integrating fundamental change of circumstance. This is borrowing the Vienna Convention treaty principle in line to the sea level rise aspect, so that we ensure that when the sea level rise brings the impact to the maritime zone, we don't have to lose our territory. Rather come up with the approach that will make interstates live amicably, but most importantly, conserve their resources. To the next. Thank you. So what are these other recommendations during the studies? There's also need of developing adaptive strategies that will help us to cope up with the shifting coastline. Because we'll see even with the case of Bangladesh, some islands are already disappearing. And in that, then you link it to the issues of maritime security framework and the disaster risk management, then there's need of awareness, so that key stakeholders understand what are the areas that need to be improved and what are the policy aspects that really needs to be considered at this point in time. We also have the issues of shoreline, increase the height of flood defense desk, which is currently happening, issues of management of erosion. So these are a lot of projects at the region that is happening, and through that, then it shows that we are heading to the direction of always coming up with a climate resilience approach. Another aspect that we really need to consider is strengthening the institutional capacity building and now awareness, especially on maritime delimitation, issues of maritime domain awareness. And there's also the aspect of now including key stakeholders, not only at the national level, but even at the regional level. So this one will improve on coming up with bilateral agreements. There's also need of establishing a comprehensive and effective policy and legal framework on ocean governance and blue economy. This is an aspect that still we're grasping because we have a lot of sectoral policies in place. But then with this, it's able to define some of the issues of maritime zone as well as the sea level rise impact. That one goes along with reviewing the policies, and also a key tool that can help us in managing the resources, especially at the boundaries. The boundaries will include the developing a marine spatial plan framework tool. So this as a tool will assist us also to enable the multi-users ocean space, and also enables us to monitor the sea level rise. At this point where we have a border where Kenya is doing exploitation of oil and then another country is doing fishing. So with that tool, then it gives you a better decision on how to share the resources within those areas. To the next slide. That being our recommendation, thank you so much, and hoping that this policy brief will be published for the nation and the regional level to consider some of these considerations coming to maritime zone disputes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercy. Very informative presentation.